angles why this text change is being proposed. One is that demand for housing in Raleigh continues to push prices higher. Displacement is increasingly a problem, particularly in South and Southeast Raleigh, but across the city, housing costs burden is a real challenge for people. And one of the ways, it's not the only way, but one of the ways that the city can, combat the housing crisis and preserve some affordability and create more affordable housing is to enable and provide more housing options. I do want to be clear that, simply increasing the supply won't necessarily, solve the affordability problem for Raleigh. And that's certainly not the intention of this text change, although one of the goals is to simply create more units, which should ease some of the pressure. The second is really the community climate action plan specifically, but larger, more generally climate change. The city has committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050. And missing middle housing types, and housing near transit and other amenities is typically producing fewer emissions. So climate and housing choice and affordability are the two big goals of this text change. And apologies, everybody, I do have a toddler and I'm at home right now. So if you hear some things, apologize. So just an overview of Missing Middle 2.0. So Missing Middle 1.0 was TC 520, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That really redefined the way the city measures density and really, the way that the city calculates how many people, how many housing units should live in a particular zoning district. That text change also introduced a few types of missing middle housing types into residential districts. So Missing Middle 2.0 really, adds on to that, creates additional tools to facilitate housing choice in Raleigh's neighborhoods. And the last bullet here, the text change really encourages and seeks to encourage increased growth and density in neighborhoods well served by bus rapid transit and planned high frequency transit lines. So real quick on that, I'm sure all of you are familiar, but the bus rapid transit plan for Raleigh would create 4 new bus rapid transit lines, which are buses that run on a dedicated bus lane, typically can be higher speed, off-boarding ticketing and that sort of things, although fares are free right now. And planned high frequency transit lines are planned for the next 5 years. So this is a build out of a bus system where buses will stop at every stop every 15 minutes. And so in those areas that are well served by those 2 types of transit, the city is hoping to see more density. And I'd be remiss if I didn't pause here to say that, we had I think we take for granted that as planners that missing middle is a concept and a term that we know very well, but not everybody does in the public. So I just want to say, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term missing middle housing, but missing middle really refers to building types. It doesn't refer to affordability. There can be affordability benefits of missing middle housing, although that's not necessarily true. But missing middle housing is essentially housing types that are in scale between single family homes and large apartment buildings. And so downtown, all throughout Raleigh, I think many of you have seen, 5-6 story apartment buildings popping up. And obviously everybody's very familiar with single family homes, but there's not much in between those. And that's really true in most American and North American cities for that matter. If you're very familiar with places like DC, Philadelphia, even older neighborhoods in Raleigh and other cities, smaller cities, The middle is not necessarily missing. Townhouses, small apartment buildings, that sort of things are very much a part of the urban landscape. But in large parts of Raleigh and other cities, that sort of middle scale of housing is missing. And so that's really what we're talking about tonight. So Missing Middle 2.0 includes a few components here. So just going to run through quickly this bullet list, and then we'll go more slowly in a little bit more detail through each of these items. So with tiny houses, we're really looking at reducing the lot size requirements, increasing the building size, and allowing for tiny houses to be used for single or 2-unit living. Flag lots. So we'll get into what a flag lot is in just a bit, but one of the sort of core concepts of this text change is to permit flag lots, in Raleigh. Lot width standards. So these are just the way that the city allows different types of housing on a lot, and regulates the minimum lot width that is needed to build a certain type of building. 2-unit townhouses, also known as duplexes. So these are, homes that have 2 units in them. So today they're not allowed in certain R4 zoning districts. These are lower density zoning districts. And so this text change would introduce the ability to build a duplex in those zoning districts. There are some ADU components. I'm sure everybody's very familiar with ADUs by now, extending the option to build ADUs related to townhouses, and increasing the ability to, or allowing for the first time, the ability to build a second ADU in proximity to frequent transit. And then, like I said, there are some standards related specifically to transit that I'll get into in just a bit. Before I really go through that list in more detail, though, I do want to make a note about homeowners associations and character protection overlays. So HOAs, govern many neighborhoods in Raleigh, particularly in North Raleigh and areas outside of the Beltline. These areas tend to have restrictive covenants, HOA covenants, that may prohibit and likely do prohibit many missing middle housing types. And just want to be very clear here that the proposed text change, and as well as those already approved standards, do not supersede HOA restrictions. So any neighborhood that is governed by an HOA deed restriction on missing middle housing, that will remain, and that will rule the day in those areas. As far as historic districts and neighborhood conservation overlay districts, which are, and that's my dog, which are zoning overlays that are intended to sort of keep an area the same in sort of scale and the way it feels and looks. So either one of those, historic districts or NCODs, those also control over these standards. And so these would not supersede any of those regulations. All right, so really going to run through this list now. So tiny house lot size reduction. And so today, tiny houses are permitted on lots that are, in R10, for example, 3,000 square feet, and in R6, 4,500 square feet. And so this text change would reduce those minimum lot areas. And that's really meant to take into account the sort of inherent benefits of compact homes. Experience from around the country tells us that tiny homes are not likely to be a predominant type of housing, as primary home. I think we may see them on flag lots or in particular locations and settings like cottage courts. But that said, there is increasing demand for these types of housing. And so we just wanted to create a little bit more flexibility to provide these types of housing units. Given their small size, they can be sort of more inherently affordable, although not necessarily so. We also want to reduce the minimum lot depth required in our 6 districts from 60 feet to 50 feet. Again, that's taking into account the smaller size of these buildings. With tiny houses, today they're permitted to be up to 600 square feet. But like I said, demand is growing for these. And for some administrative purposes, This text change would increase the permitted square footage of a tiny house to 1,200 square feet. But importantly, we also want to limit the building footprint of a tiny house to 800 square feet. And that's really intended to preserve pervious surfaces on lots and reduce as much as possible the need to cut trees and other vegetation down where folks do want to build a tiny home. So the last change to the tiny house standards that the text change proposes is to allow a 2-unit tiny house. And we'll get into a little bit more detail where we think these might occur in a little bit. But again, so if you've got a 1,200 square foot tiny house, this text change would allow you to subdivide that into 2 or to build it into 2 units such that each one was 600 square feet, or maybe one was 800 and one was 400, but a total of 1,200 square feet across 2 units. So flag lots, somewhat related to tiny houses, and there's a slide coming up that sort of gets into the overlap of these two. But flag lots, as you can see in the diagram here, are lots that look like flags. They've got a narrow sort of pole-like portion that fronts onto the street, almost always providing access to that lot via a driveway, and a sort of larger flag-like portion almost always in the rear of the lot. The pole can provide a shared driveway across the original lot and the new flag lot. One of the reasons why this text change proposes to permit flag lots in Raleigh is because most banks, lending institutions won't provide traditional loans to build an accessory dwelling unit. And so for a homeowner who would like to build an ADU, maybe they've got a family member they'd like to, have living on their property, that sort of thing. Maybe they want to build an ADU to generate some additional income. Maybe it's the land trust would like to create a flag lot to create more inventory. It's a way for them to access lending to build that unit. And so that's really the primary reason why this is proposed. So again, flag lots. So this area in pink here, that is the flag lot. So we, in this text change, are proposing to permit only tiny houses on flag lots. I think we have experience from other cities where flag lots have been permitted, and they have not restricted the size of these buildings such that, a developer might buy a home in a neighborhood, subdivide a flag lot, and then construct a very large house in that flag lot, in that rear flag lot. For reasons of protecting neighborhood character, and because flag lots are sort of this somewhat intimate introduction of additional housing into neighborhoods, we really wanted to limit the size of those units. Again, that would be a maximum 800 square foot footprint, but with the total square footage up to 1,200 square feet. So the next set of standards that we propose to change in the text change, it deals with lot width. So small apartment buildings, if you're familiar with Raleigh's older neighborhoods, those right around downtown, there are many small apartment buildings, 4 to 6 units usually, and they fit quite nicely into neighborhoods. Generally, not much larger, if at all, than a typical single family home. And so we want to take that into account with that. But today, a lot, it requires much greater width to build a small apartment building. And so we really want to change that. So this text change would permit apartment buildings on lots with a minimum width of 45 feet in R10 districts. And also in the other districts, permit apartment buildings on lots with the same minimum lot width as required for detached and attached houses. So if you've got a 45-foot lot width, a lot that's 45 feet wide in an R10 district, you'd be able to build a small apartment building, a single family home, and a duplex. And just a note on the affordability here, well, it's not necessarily true that if somebody were to build a 4-unit apartment in an R10 district that those apartments would necessarily be cheaper than a single family home. It is likely, given the sort of land cost per unit, that it would be priced below what a single family house would. Just another sort of note on lot width standards. So these are examples of small apartment buildings that fit into neighborhoods. And so these 4 within the green box here, those are actually in Raleigh's neighborhoods, probably familiar with some of them. Mordecai Manor is one that is frequently shown. This is in the Mordecai neighborhood. It is a 6-unit apartment building in a neighborhood that is, been on the ground for probably 100 years now, in a thriving neighborhood. But these types of apartment buildings exist all over South and Southeast Raleigh as well. If you drive down Martin and Davie Street, you'll see some going out east of downtown. Should also say that there are many single-family homes, originally what were single-family homes in some older neighborhoods that have themselves been subdivided into smaller apartments, and this text change would allow for more of this. On the right, you just see more recent examples of new missing middle apartments. So 2-unit townhouses in R4 districts. And so again, today duplexes are not allowed in the R4 districts. So this text change would propose to allow those. This image at the bottom, this is from Austin, Texas, a sort of lower density neighborhood where in a city just like Raleigh, where that is growing significantly and there is demand for more housing, and they have allowed duplexes in these lower density neighborhoods, and we think it could be an option for folks. So accessory dwelling units, with townhouse developments increasingly common in Raleigh, this text change would propose to allow ADUs on those lots for the first time. So today, a townhouse development, the developer is not allowed to include ADUs. A townhouse owner is not allowed to build an ADU in their backyard. So again, if you live in a townhouse, if you own your townhouse, and again, you've got elderly disabled family member who you'd like to live on your property, today you can't do that. So this text change would allow you to build an ADU on your townhouse lot. Within proximity to those BRT and other high frequency transit lines, this text change would allow a second accessory dwelling unit in those areas only. So this is not a citywide rule change that is proposed, but only in those areas that are very close to transit. And those areas are also where demand tends to be highest for new housing units. Just a note on this, there are states in the United States, provinces in Canada that have required recently that municipalities in their jurisdictions permit 2 accessory dwelling units, states that generally, and provinces that are seeing rapid growth and appreciation and demand for more housing. And so we think this is a way to introduce some more units into these high demand areas. Don't think it will be see a lot of uptake of second ADU units, but we want to create more flexibility. And these images sort of just illustrate how that might happen in a way that protects the sort of character of a neighborhood and minimizes the impact to neighbors. So these next 4 slides are going to talk a little bit more in detail about that high frequency transit area. And so this is a map, and apologies, it's quite technical, but this is a map that's actually proposed to be in the comprehensive plan. The areas shaded in the sort of purplish and then gray area outlined in the dashed line, those are the frequent transit areas. So again, that's within a half mile of any bus rapid transit line or a quarter mile of any of those high frequency or 15-minute bus lines. So these next standards, these next slides really are in that area with the sort of dashed black line. So you see most of Raleigh, the vast majority of Raleigh, these next standards would not apply to that. So apartments today, they're not permitted in R6 and R4 districts, and that's generally good policy throughout the city. But again, in those areas that are close to transit, in order to create the density needed to support transit, and in order to respond to increasing demand near those transit areas. The city would like to encourage more, or at least the ability to build apartment buildings in those R6 and R4 districts within proximity to transit. And again, this is just an illustration of, how apartment buildings might look in a sort of lower density setup. Similarly, in R4 districts, townhouses, we talked a little bit earlier about 2-unit townhouses, or otherwise known as duplexes, being allowed citywide in the R4 district. So this is townhouses, typically, 5 in a row, and they might be part of a larger subdivision of townhouses. This text change would allow those types of townhouse developments in R4 districts when they are close to transit. The 2 images you see here, those are actually 2 townhouse developments in Raleigh. The upper one, obviously newer, in an area just east of Oakwood, and the one on the south is just a few blocks north of NC State, and actually a townhouse development from the early mid 20th century. So lot area per unit standards in transit proximate areas. So again, the first missing middle text change, TC5, changed the way the city calculates density. So this one would reduce the minimum lot area per unit required to build a housing unit per zoning district. So in an R10 district, which is the highest density residential only district in the city, the amount of land that you would need on a lot to build a unit is, I don't have the exact number right in front of me. I want to say 800 feet, but it sort of ratchets up as you go to the lower density zoning districts. And so again, this is a way to target density and help the city meet its climate action plan goals. Just a note on the height bonus in mixed use districts. So today, mixed use districts currently zoned for a maximum of 3 stories, located within those high frequency transit lines, can be suited ideally to accommodate additional density and space for jobs. So the text change would allow for apartments and mixed use buildings to have a 2-story height bonus, which is create a maximum of 5 stories. Or 80 feet, and general buildings, which is residential only, of a 1-story height bonus up to 68 feet. When those projects come in with what is called an urban frontage or an urban plaza, those developments would not include drive-throughs as a rule. So I know that was a lot. I'm going to stop sharing my slides, but before I do that, feel free to visit the public engagement site for this text change. There is an email address here. If you have questions, if you want to follow up with one of us later, send us an email at textchanges@raleighnc.gov. We can put that in the chat again, but with that, I'm going to stop sharing, open it up to questions from the chat. And again, if you have questions and would like to sort of pose your question just by asking it, raise your hand, use the Zoom raise your hand function, and we'll get to you. So thanks, everybody.
Hey, Charles. So I'm going to work through some of the questions we got in the chat. There's been some conversation there, and I think some of them have been answered, but I'm just going to go through one by one to make sure the folks who asked have a clear understanding. So the first question we got was from Mark Daly. Will our comments have any impact on the plan moving forward? Of course, we are here to sort of field your questions and also respond to those questions. The Planning Commission is the principal advisory body for land use policy in the city, and that's sort of the first stop in the review process. And so comments received through the engagement portal or emailed directly to the Planning Commission or verbalized at a Planning Commission meeting are really the best ways to make sure that your comments have an impact on the plan moving forward. Also, after it moves to the Planning Commission, it will go to the City Council as well. So again, absolutely welcome your comments in this forum, but we want to make it clear that there are groups that advise on the policy and we provide professional input, but it's really best if comments and concerns, if you have them, or support or messages of support are directed towards those groups. So hopefully that answers your question, Mark. The next question from Lisa was, for all the new missing middle housing, will existing setbacks from each lot line be the same as existing? Also, are those setback standards citywide?
I would probably defer to Eric and Keegan because I think they can more technically answer this question, but setback standards vary by zoning district. And so if, for example, if you're in an R10 zoning district, which are typically those areas closer to downtown, or perhaps where townhouses are developed, the setbacks tend to be smaller than what they might be in an R6 and an R4 district, or an R2 district for that matter. So yeah, they're not citywide. The first part
I can speak to the specifics of that if you want.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Eric.
The main changes are that in R4, currently it's required a 20-foot front yard setback for the structures that are allowed within R4. In these transit areas, we're proposing to move that to 20 feet. The other setbacks that are changing are in the R4, R6, and R10, which currently for multifamily structures would require a 10-foot setback, or a single family structure, a 10-foot setback. We're proposing to move that to 5 feet. And then lastly, the change for rear yards for R4 moves it from 30 feet to 25 feet. In R6 from 20 feet to 15 feet. And same for R10 from 20 feet to 15-foot rear yard setbacks. So there are some changes, but they're fairly modest in terms of.
And what about side setback?
Those are all proposed to be 5. Currently, they're 10 for a multifamily structure, or even in R4, a detached structure. So it's proposed to be reduced down by 5 feet in the frequent transit area.
So Lisa, did that answer your question? Did you have any other follow-up to Eric's response?
Yeah, I know it's not a straightforward answer. My concern is that in some of the R10 areas that you would have where houses are already fairly close together, that you would have a new structure go up that's 2 to 3 to 4 stories, 5 feet on the side, and the existing house next to it is basically going to be overpowered. That was my concern. But if you're talking about these setbacks are only in the TOD areas.
Not TOD, but frequent transit area, as on that.
How is that different? So how is high transit different than the BRT?
I'll let Charles speak to that.
Yeah, Lisa, it looks like you've done your homework. So the TOD overlay specifically applied directly adjacent to bus rapid transit lines, and it's not applied yet. I mean, those are, the TOD is an overlay. So when that is applied to the map, that goes through a zoning change process, just like any other rezoning. And so there is a separate community engagement process for that. And so I hope you partake in that. So this frequent transit development option differs from the overlay in that it is not an overlay. It simply creates an additional option that is applied to lots within that proximity to transit. So within a half mile of BRT or within a quarter mile of high frequency transit. And the frequent transit development option is applied mostly to residentially zoned lots. There are going to be some mixed use lots where it is applied, which that last slide spoke to, but for the most part, this is dealing with residential lots that are much less likely to be assembled or to be able to be assembled, although it's not impossible to build, larger apartment buildings. But again, that is the difference. The TOD does have a height bonus that essentially allows 50% more height. So a 3-story building could go up to 5, or a 5-story could go up to 7 if certain affordability standards are provided, and maybe some other standards. I don't have the ordinance in front of me right now, but that's really the difference between TOD and the frequent transit development option. The frequent transit development option is mostly aimed at missing middle housing. And I would say the TOD development option is going to be mostly your sort of larger scale apartments directly on bus rapid transit lines in those areas, probably closer into town, or where the zoning sort of already permits some sort of mixed use. So for example, a shopping center that's along New Bern Avenue that, when applied with the TOD, would allow the developer to a height bonus in exchange for some community benefits like affordable housing, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it sounds like a slippery slope, because this is the first time I've heard of frequent transit development options, and that just sounds like an opening a can of worms. But I do not want to derail this meeting, so I will table any other discussion on that for now.
Thank you, Lisa, and please reach out if you want to continue to have a discussion with any one of us. Be happy to.
And Lisa, I did just want to respond to one question that you had related to building height and how that may differ in an R10 district. The short answer is there really won't be any change in building height, even within these frequent transit development options. All structures would be limited to 3 stories in height, and detached and attached houses would be limited to 40 feet, which is this exact same standard as today. And townhouses and apartments would be limited to 45, again, the same standard as today. And in R10, all of these building types are already permitted. So it's really looking at increasing the density to a degree, however, not necessarily the bulk in those R10 districts.
Thanks.
So I'm going to proceed to the next question, and just out of fairness, because it's difficult for me to know when all these hands are raised, I'm going to move to Bob Geary and then probably alternate back and forth between those raising their hands and the comment section, if that's okay with the group. So Bob, go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, Keegan. Hello, Charles. I am interested in the frequent transit development option and how it relates to the BRT overlay bonus. The BRT overlay, first of all, has not been mapped yet, has it?
That's right. You're right.
But if it's mapped, when it's mapped, it allows a density bonus if the developer offers affordable units. This transit development option seems to say anything within 20 minutes, within half a mile of a bus route, or what we laughably call a frequent bus route, gets a 2-story density bonus if it's, let's see, for apartment or mixed use building, automatically with no affordable units required. So is that, am I reading that right? That as soon as this is mapped over Raleigh within half a mile of a frequent transit corridor, that the BRT density bonus will become moot?
Not within an area that's actually mapped with the TOD. The thinking is that within a quarter mile, I believe, of the BRT lines, those will get mapped to the TOD. And so those regulations will really supersede anything in this ordinance this was really intended, if you remember the discussions about TODR, R standing for residential, what was going to be sort of taking place a little further afield from the actual BRT lines. So this ordinance really doesn't kick in for those properties that have a TOD map along those corridors until you get beyond that quarter mile. So it's for the next quarter mile beyond is where these rules would really apply. Within a quarter mile of the BRT line itself, the TOD rules are going to govern.
So,
Now, in the interim, until those TOD areas are mapped with an actual rezoning, these are the only rules that are going to apply. So yes, someone could do this within closer proximity to a planned BRT if that actual BRT TOD rezoning has not taken place.
well, Eric, hey, I'm sorry. I should have said hello to you as well. I understand that, but the TOD overlays have not been mapped.
Correct.
And the city council has been dragging its feet on mapping them for, I'm going to say 4 years, but maybe it's more than that. And I don't see them hustling to do it yet. And meanwhile, this will be an entitlement for developers or for any landowner who owns property within half a mile of a bus route, that they get an extra 2 stories, and they are not going to need to or want to be governed by the density bonus requiring affordable units. And let me just be clear, my point is not against density near transit, but it needs to include affordable units. And this text change seems to be an end run around that.
Ultimately, nothing in this frequent transit development option would be available to any prospective developer until the city council adopts the map. So ultimately, they do control the timing of the adoption of that map, just as they do the timing of a rezoning for a TOD. So that's certainly a point that you might want to continue to hone in on, because ultimately, that's a decision for council as to whether or not they release the provisions herein well in advance of a TOD rezoning or not. But ultimately, they set the timetable for both of those actions. Even if they adopt this ordinance, nothing in this frequent transit development option can be done until a map is incorporated into the comprehensive plan using this title.
Okay, well, thanks for that.
They are tied together.
Yeah.
Now we do, as I think Charles may have mentioned, anticipate, a similar tracking as far as the review of that map, at least at the beginning. Now it may well languish long behind the adoption of this ordinance, provided this goes through. But they do not have to be adopted simultaneously. But if the map is not adopted, again, no provisions herein, have impact. You're probably familiar with the NCOD. It's very similar to an NCOD process in that, you adopt a regulation, but it doesn't go into effect until a remapping has occurred, in that case, through a rezoning. But this would just occur through a comprehensive plan amendment map adoption. It's a lighter lift, but ultimately, it is a decision point that the council takes in terms of when to flip that switch.
I just wanted to add one more comment on the specific height bonuses that are permitted under each. One being the TOD, again, transit overlay district, which is geared solely towards properties very close to those proposed BRT lines. That particular height bonus would apply to whatever the base zoning is and would allow a bonus of in stories of 50%, provided 20% of those residential units within the newly allotted stories are affordable to those earning 60% AMI for a period of 30 years. And so you could potentially see a much greater height bonus within the TOD, depending on what your underlying district would permit. Whereas with this frequent transit development option, which again is a little bit more expansive, it's again a height bonus, but to a lesser degree, and then it applies to districts that are only capped at 3 stories. So those mixed use districts that are limited to 3 stories today could be a maximum of 5. And we realize there is a little bit of give and take there, which is why one reason we welcome your comments, but I just want to note that it's not the exact same bonus offered in one place versus the other. And there is a bit of a difference depending on what the underlying zoning is.
Yeah, and in residential, there's no height bonus whatsoever.
Correct.
Well, no, I appreciate that, but it would be something to think about to add a requirement for this bonus, similar to the other bonus in the TOD zone, to require affordable units. So why are we proposing to allow a developer to put a 5-story mixed use building within half a mile of of frequent transit and not include any affordable units at all? I thought the whole point of transit was let's have some affordability near the transit. So I would suggest that change be considered.
Thanks, Bob. It's
Thanks.
A point well taken. Do want to add just a couple things. That last point. And I urge you to take your comments, like Egan said, to the Planning Commission and Council, and I'm sure you're very familiar with that process. With BRT, you alluded to, you had a comment about high frequency transit and alluding to whether or not that's actually sort of high quality, high frequency transit. I happen to think a bus that comes every 15 minutes is quite good. But some of the thinking here is that BRT is the premier transit in Raleigh. It is what could potentially get folks to and from point A and B quicker. And the TOD overlay would focus more affordable housing directly adjacent to that premier transit. I know that, I know you're not going to love that answer, but I think that will potentially prove true in some instances. The other thing here that I want to say about your very good question and comment, but also to any other, questions or comments about affordability, is that, this is a text change to the UDO. So any affordable housing developer, whether that's, a traditional low-income housing tax credit developer, whether that is a group like CASA, whether that is the Raleigh Area Land Trust or any other land trust, they'll be able to take advantage of these rule changes as well. And also on affordability is, the planning department, we work closely with the Housing and Neighborhoods Department. We know we need to do a better job working together to identify affordable housing opportunities that might be outside of the market. So we are constantly looking at that. But again, in those situations where perhaps the city may control land or have an opportunity to purchase land, or perhaps there's, a religious institution that has a little bit of extra land and they want to build some affordable housing, they'll be able to take advantage of these as well. But it's a point well taken. Affordable housing, this is not a magic bullet to create affordable housing, but it is one way that it could dampen.
So I'm just going to work through a few other questions that we got in the chat. I think most of these have actually been answered. But for those who asked, just feel free to jump in if you don't feel you got a sufficient answer. From Mark, will there be fencing requirements for flag lots to protect privacy of neighbors? I believe Eric answered that question. No, there's not currently a proposed requirement for fencing. I will say we based a lot of the flag lot regulations off of what you can do today with an ADU. And so today an ADU can be built at the same setbacks as we're proposing a tiny home on a flag lot without fencing. We felt that there was good reason to treat them pretty similar, considering from the street, there may not be a readily apparent difference between a flag lot and ADU. The difference may just be on paper and on the plat that subdivides the property. So hopefully that answers your question, Mark.
Keegan, can I just add something real quick here? And
Certainly.
It's a good point. We are, sensitive to impacts to neighbors. One of the reasons why we limited tiny homes rather to smaller sizes. The point I want to make is that flag lot, people living on a flag lot are also interested in their own privacy. And I think that, they, not only their neighbors, but they themselves would like to have some privacy. And so given that many flag lots might be sold on the market or might be lived in by a friend or family member, we think that fences probably likely, they're not required, but again, that person living in that flag lot tiny home probably wants to preserve their own privacy as well.
Thanks, Charles. So going to go back to those who have their hands raised. David Blanton.
Yeah, thanks. So I actually work for a developer and we do some stuff in Raleigh and like South Raleigh and in Southeast Raleigh and in Durham. And it's the tiny house option is like a big thing in Durham right now. That's like really cool and allows for some like affordability stuff, which is desirable and kind of, cool to be able to do in some of like the older neighborhoods that otherwise like would price most everybody out. So, but one of the processes that they have there, and I'm just curious if this text change has like broached this or considered it or has an allowance for it of some kind, is like they have like almost an exempt plat process, which basically like you submit more or less a survey and go right to like a recombination map for splitting a lot, whether that's a flag lot or whether it's a tiny house, like a small house recombination. Because right now the burden is, it's like usually like a 6 to 8 week time frame. There's right-of-way dedication, pretty significant spending and engineering, which like just makes the lots more expensive. So like takes away from some of the affordability and in some cases density with the right-of-way dedication and things like that. So I was curious if there was any kind of consideration or if there's been a plan to adopt I guess a more streamlined process for some of these more minor subdivisions where you're just like adding a flag lot or maybe splitting a really large lot into maybe 4 tiny homes or something like that.
Yeah, David, I'm happy to answer that. I don't have a firm answer in the sense that it's not something we have to share with you all. However, the council has authorized us to work on refining our zoning permit process. Also, what some may refer to as tier 0 site plans. So the system has a site plan tiering system that sort of goes up depending on the intensity of the project. And
Right.
I think made a lot of strides a few years ago, but we've heard from the development community that there's other types of projects that should particularly or potentially be considered a tier 0 that don't have to potentially comply even with what a tier 1 complies with today. And as part of that conversation, we have discussed internally reviewing our subdivision regulations to potentially create a carve out or a similar type of tiering system for subdivisions so that they, as you said, could enjoy potentially a more expedited process or one that doesn't require the same level of exaction. So that is something we're hoping to fold into that active text change, which is on zoning permits. And there's a likelihood that you could see a component related to those types of exempt subdivisions.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Just kind of like a little mini case study we had in this is like earlier this year, we have a lot that right now technically could be able to get 3 townhomes on. Built as like an apartment or like a condo style kind of building. And because of the right-of-way dedication alone and the, $30,000 ensuing engineering bill and stuff like that, not to mention the costs of putting in sidewalks and stuff like that, it basically like we had to go to a duplex, and that just totally shifts like the product, the price of that product, you know. So there's definitely, I mean, especially in like more areas where some of the negative effects of development are felt more acutely in like Southeast Raleigh and South Raleigh, like I would say there's definitely a really strong need for that, because there's an appetite, I think a desire in, you know, at least our company and I think some others kind of that work in that area to do more like, you know, sensitive kind of projects. But some of the timelines and the sort of like ensuing costs of bearing those timelines make a lot of that less or not necessarily less desirable, but less like realistic or feasible. So anyways, my 2 cents on that.
Thanks, David. We really appreciate the comments. And as I said, stay tuned to that particular text change, because there is some likelihood that that concept will be incorporated. Just want to go back to the questions we have in the chat. And Lisa, I see that you included a question related to parking. I know Eric provided an answer.
Yep, that's okay. I got it answered.
Was that sufficient? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. Great. Okay. Michael Nguyen, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. So I am a first-time new homeowner. I just moved here. I lived here a few years ago as a student, and I'm excited to be back. And I'm really, really excited to see all this work that you guys are doing on expanding the sort of housing options in Raleigh. As someone who just went through the home buying process, it was not fun, at least not right now. And, you know, there were several neighborhoods where I was sort of priced out because the options available were either, they were either too expensive or just would not, is too much, right? So, you know, I'm really excited to see that. My question is, what sort of work is being done to make sure that the new sort of housing options are going to also accommodate younger families? So, you know, the sort of footprint that people with like children versus, you know, older people trying to age in their sort of homes or in their neighborhoods versus, you know, younger people without children. These are like completely different like size footprints. And I know in other, you know, developed places, they have like 3 to 5 floor sort of like buildings with like a couple of units on each floor, rather than, you know, sort of the modern sort of 5-floor apartment buildings where there's like 10 units on each floor, you know, or everybody has a single family house. So I'm not sure where and sort of what you guys are proposing with this zoning change that would fit.
Excellent comment and question. Yes, housing for families is a significant problem. Most of the apartment buildings that you see going up downtown, areas like North Hills, going out, and this is even more true in the areas near NC State, most of the units in those buildings are 1-bedroom studios. You might get a small percentage of 2 bedrooms. Rarely do you get many 3-bedroom units in those buildings. It is a problem. Missing middle housing, you know, tends to produce more of those 2-unit apartments. Tiny homes, you know, an 800 square foot tiny home is, you know, can be large enough for a 2-bedroom house that can be more affordable. Also, probably sited in a neighborhood that is maybe more conducive to raising a family, maybe a little bit easier to walk to a playground, maybe a little bit easier to walk to school, bike to school, access parks and that sort of thing. It's a great question. I mean, I think ultimately you might see more sort of missing middle housing built for those sort of families. And the other part there is, again, affordable housing developers are building more family-sized units. They typically do. There is great demand for affordable units for families with children. And so again, they'll be able to take advantage of these as well. But yeah, I mean, when I myself lived in a 3-story, I've lived in various 3-story walk-up apartments in a couple of different cities where there were, 2 to 4 units on each floor. And, apartment was maybe 700 square feet with 2 bedrooms. And yeah, I think would love to see the market respond to that sort of demand.
And just to follow up on Charles's point, one of the intentions of this text change, of course, we've talked about missing middle housing. We've talked about alternative housing types that are not just single family detached homes or sort of the mega block apartments, which are pretty much the predominant typologies, maybe including townhouses, which I think are sort of probably the most common type of missing middle housing has some popularity in the area. But I think one of the goals of this text change is introducing those housing types, which hopefully do have floor plans and are of floor areas that could accommodate small families and are not just geared towards those who are single or may only be a couple, for instance. Allowing those in more areas throughout the city, potentially where land values are cheaper and there won't be as strong an emphasis to pack as many units into such a small area, which is what we see in our mixed use districts in the very hot kind of real estate areas of the city. And so there is an effect of sort of spreading out this density in a way that we think and hope is appropriate, and also means that you could potentially see alternative housing types that are geared towards more types of people instead of, again, those smaller units, which is what we see built today in the sort of multifamily space. So I know there's some chat going, or excuse me, some comments going on in the chat, and that's great to see. Hopefully, if anyone has any continued questions or comments, please feel free to leave those there. I am gonna move on to the next person, assuming, Michael, that answered your question.
Yep, I'm good,
Okay.
thank you.
Thanks, Michael. So moving on to Mark Daly.
Yes, first of all, thank you guys very much for doing this. I know this is not an enviable job. And I've spoke with Eric and I think both Keegan about another matter in the past, and you guys have been great in helping guide me through some issues with a dog kennel being put up next door. So thank you. But I do have a question as far as the high density of adding the apartments or the fourplex in existing neighborhoods. Will there be a limit to how many can be put in, or can a developer just come in, start buying up homes and build these all next to one another, and the entire street becomes an apartment street? And maybe there's 1 or 2 holdouts that want to stay there, they like where they are, and they've been just squeezed out by apartments. Or is there a limit to how many can go into an area or on a street? I'll stop talking.
Yeah, so there is no limit other than the market. So in the type of area that you described, where maybe developers are acquiring properties and building apartment buildings, that likely would happen only if there's clear demand for it. The price per unit is going to be smaller generally. The total sort of revenue to the developer might be more, might be equal. But if we're seeing that, on a block that today let's say there's a block that has 10 single family homes, and developers come and buy 8 of those, and there's 2 single family homes remaining, and the other 8 are replaced by a combination of duplexes and quad apartments, and ultimately you see 28 units where there were 10 originally. That does likely mean there's just that much demand for housing, and hopefully it means that a good percentage of those people are using transit more than driving everywhere. Still likely that, at least in the short term, that folks are going to have cars. But again, this is all aiming toward getting more people within proximity to transit and amenities such that we don't have to have so many cars on the streets. That creates more space for sidewalks, more space for pedestrians, more space for people on bicycles, more space for kids to play in neighborhoods, that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, I would say, Mark, I don't anticipate that in the vast majority of neighborhoods that you're likely to see that sort of rapid change. I mean, it could happen in some neighborhoods that are already experiencing rapid change. But the sort of status quo, the last thing I'll say is that the status quo is, let's say there's that same block of 10 homes. In most neighborhoods, what is happening is homeowners are selling, developers are buying those properties. They might be investors buying those properties, and they're flipping them back into single family homes at prices that are much higher than what is typically found in that area, which drives up prices more and more. So you see more people becoming housing cost burden, particularly those people who might be on fixed income, particularly people who might have lived in that neighborhood for a long time and bought a long time ago, and simply don't have the type of income needed to maintain that property or to afford the tax increase, that sort of thing.
Right. Okay, well, thank you for your comment. But I just would like to say that it's interesting that on this call, we've got a developer that has called in. So they're already swooping in and they're seeing dollar signs. So that is what will happen. We know that. I'm in construction. I deal with developers all the time. They exist for one thing: to make money, not to improve anything, just to make money. So we need a protection, and I implore you guys to try to encourage the folks that y'all are in contact with to give us some type of protection, some type of insurance that it won't squeeze someone out that has lived in the neighborhood forever. And I realize we need to take this to the city council, but my experience with the city council is when they go for a vote and they hear people, it's already made up, the deals have been made. So I want to make sure that, the folks that say a retiree that lives in a neighborhood, loves his neighborhood, is not just pushed out. And that needs to be a real important factor in all of these decisions. But thank you guys. I mean, you guys have been great. Eric, I've spoke with you a few times. You're probably tired of talking to me, but I really appreciate you and Keegan and all of you guys. This is not, it can be a very positive thing, but there needs to be some controls, or, the golden rule is the guys with the gold rule. So we need to protect some folks while this is going on.
Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you.
So I see that there was I actually don't know who posed their question first, but maybe to start with the chat, because we had, we just heard from a person who had raised their hand. Michael Nguyen asked, is there an estimate for how much additional revenue this zoning change will produce? I will say, I can't provide an answer to that, but I will say, in addition to it being a hard question to answer on its face, one of the things that we understand as a reality is that given the change in zoning laws, not just in Raleigh, but also in many other places throughout the country that have placed limitations on a variety of housing typologies, we typically have builders that are experienced only in a few forms. And so we're hoping that by enabling these alternative housing types, we will start to either incentivize or push some of our particularly smaller developers into building these types of missing middle housing. But we also think that's probably going to be somewhat of a slow process, which is one reason we've made special attention to try and track some of the effects of the changes that we've introduced via TC 520. And also, assuming this text change passes in some form, this text change as well. But it's a really excellent question. But I do not believe, unless someone in the department has knowledge that I'm not aware of, that we've done an exact estimate, nor that it would be very easy to produce one that's super reliable. So apologies, Michael, can't give you a more concrete answer, but hopefully you understand the limitations there. Stuart Diebel, apologies if I mispronounced your name.
Stuart, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay, yes, it's Stuart Diebel. And here's my question. If this passes, how many new housing units do you think will come to market within, say, 5 years or 10 years? Are we talking about a few, a lot? Do you have any idea of the scope of new houses that will come on the market if this passes?
That is an excellent question, and I do not have an answer. I would say that is the type of analysis that we could attempt to do. Similar to the last question, it's sort of hard to predict. I think we can learn from the experiences of other cities and that have maybe gone through some of these missing middle housing changes within the previous few years and see, what the uptake has been. And it will vary by neighborhood, right? So I think in those areas that you're seeing demand increasing significantly, you're probably going to see more uptake of missing middle housing. But again, that could relieve some pressure on existing residents. We don't know, Stuart. I will take your comment up the chain and see if we can do some sort of analysis. It is very complex analysis, but it's not impossible to do. We can at least do some research on what uptake has been with missing middle housing.
There are also a lot of other forces that determine that outcome: interest rates, pandemics, threats of world war. There's a lot of factors that might influence uptake or a slowdown in construction. Supply chain availability. There's a whole lot of factors that we really can't predict.
And I understand that. I think it's a great goal to have more housing for more people. But I have no idea the magnitude. And obviously, no one has an answer yet. I hope it's a big number, but it would be nice to have somebody look into that.
Thank you, Stuart. Great comment.
Thank you. Good job, guys. Thank you.
So we have another question, and I think we provided some answers, but just want to make sure. Allison, your question related to whether or not there are restrictions on developers to achieve denser housing goals and concerns over whether or not we could just get more single family homes. I know Eric and I provided some responses, just wanted to make sure we answered your question appropriately.
Oh yeah, it's been great. I know you guys are kind of tied to what the market has and those restrictions. I'm just curious what we can do.
If you look at the frequent transit development option, particularly in the residential zoning districts, in the column where it talks about land area per dwelling unit, I believe is how it's, let's see what the term is. lot area required per unit, you can see that the amount of land area goes down. 2-unit living requires less land area per unit than single unit living does. And then multi-unit living requires even less land than 2-unit living does per unit. So we've done, some of the, we've tipped the scales to some extent in favor of 3 or more units developments where that is optimal. And we're hopefully that will somewhat influence, the economics, which, as we all know, to some extent, impact the final outcome. And there's also efficiency in terms of construction. When you're doing 3 or more units, there's less materials needed per unit, et cetera. And so there's some cost efficiencies associated with that, which also tend to favor that type of development from a return on investment standpoint.
Okay, thank you. That's a very complete answer to my question, so I appreciate it.
Hey, I just want to, that last point Eric made was really good, and I just want to add a little bit of another point about that, is that the efficiency of multi-unit living, even duplexes, when units are sharing walls, those units require less energy to heat and to cool. So that's one way that missing middle housing can help combat emissions in the city. There's still other ways that architects and builders probably need to adapt their practices to build more energy efficient buildings and building types, but this will, I think, encourage more use of that. Also want to say we had a really good comment last night. If you want to watch that one, if you're not too tired of us, but there was a comment about energy efficiency of buildings and whether or not we can sort of require certain levels of efficiency. And one of the answers to that is that the North Carolina Building Code, like other states, simply doesn't allow some of the more innovative sort of energy efficient types of construction that you see across Europe, for example, or Japan, some other places. Simply not allowed to sort of build that type of building. I think, supply chains are different here. I think you see building materials and practices in places like Europe that might be a little more efficient. And so, we can't dictate what North Carolina building codes are. The city of Raleigh, like other cities and jurisdictions, do have staff that are on the sort of boards that help write the code, so we can try and influence a little bit to increase the efficiency of the energy efficiency of them, but we can't control that aspect completely.
Indirectly, that does affect, affordability to some extent. While it may, the price point of purchasing or renting one of these units, is what the market will bear. Ultimately, the person that buys that and is paying a monthly mortgage is also going to be paying monthly electric and or gas bills, and they need to allow for that ability to make those payments monthly. So if a unit is smaller and or more energy efficient, theoretically that's more money on the table to pay toward other things. So it does impact affordability indirectly, because that's an ongoing cost that the owner or occupant would ultimately have to bear.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any other hands raised or questions in the chat, but if there are any, we are available, of course, and we'll be staying on the line a while longer, or as long as people want to participate. But certainly, please let us know any questions that come to mind, or if there was anything that was reviewed in the presentation. Mark. Thank you, Mark, for attending. If there's anything that comes to mind or anything that maybe wasn't quite so clear in the presentation, we're happy to try and provide a better explanation. And also the portal will be open for about 3 more weeks, I believe. So still plenty of time to leave your comments and questions there. And I will say too, for those who are feeling particularly ambitious and have the availability, we highly encourage those who can to attend the text change committee meetings. Again, that's a committee of the Planning Commission. So first stop on the review train. And the benefit of that committee is one, right now, at least they're meeting virtually. It's also a very informal atmosphere. There's not typically that many attendees. And so you probably get all the time you'd wish to speak if you want to make comment. And also I will say our text change committee members are really responsive to feedback that they receive. We have a diversity of folks on that committee from different backgrounds. And Lisa, it is going to appear on their agenda next Tuesday. We're working to get the Planning Commission website updated with that WebEx link so folks can join as attendees. You can also let Justin Booker, who's on this call, know if you want to participate, meaning speak, but you're more than welcome to just attend. And if you cannot attend, the meeting will be recorded and posted to our YouTube page if you want to watch afterwards. So just wanted to throw that out there. It's really a great way for people to engage.
Also, it's the only thing on the agenda that day. So you can anticipate about 2 hours of missing middle fun.
I guess if there's no other questions on the text change, looks like maybe Bob has a comment. But just wanted, if anyone has any comments or thoughts on this format of engagement, or also what types of forms of engagement you would like to see in the future, we're open to that type of feedback as well. Due to staff time and the resources it takes to put on these types of sessions, it's difficult to do it for every single one, but high impact text changes, we're going to have a focus for doing these types of forums so we can make people even more aware. We're also trying to improve the types of information we include on the website, but if people have suggestions for different types of engagement, or if you belong to a particular stakeholder group that you think would benefit from a presentation, assuming we're able to find that time, we're happy to do that as well. So please just let us know. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks everyone for the very generous comments. Yeah, we understand that sometimes information is hard, and even when you do find it, it can be technical. And so we do hope that these presentations and sessions help to break down some of that complexity and make it a little easier for folks to understand.
Let me ask a real quick question that's perhaps not super related, but it seems like nobody else has much. So where is the best place to get information about municipal zoning? I'm in District D, and where I'm at in District D, there's lots of interesting wiggles in the map, and there's like holes in the map. And I'm just really curious about the what this means. And I'm not sure where exactly to hunt this down. I've spent a little bit of time digging through the Raleigh.gov website, and I've not been super successful. Maybe somebody here would know.
Are you thinking about differences in like allowed uses and densities? Is that sort of thing, what those different colors on the map mean?
No. So I'm not really sure if it's municipal zone. It's not necessarily a Raleigh zoning map. I don't have the tooling for that's pretty effective. I'm talking mostly about the actual like zones of the districts. So there's sections of road where one side of the road is, I'm not sure if this may be just the boundaries of Raleigh, the municipal boundaries of Raleigh, or what. But I'm not sure where I would maybe get that information if that's out there anymore.
So district boundaries themselves, is that what you're referring to, Michael?
Yes. So yeah, I could call out the actual like streets where it happens and stuff, but I'm just not sure.
Yeah, so actually, I mean, we have the time. I'm happy to show just a small demo to maybe make it a little easier. Do you have the address?
Yeah, it's yeah, let me see if I can pull up the spot here.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm
That's okay. Yeah, the Wake County and the city's IMAP system is probably the best if you have questions about specific
Is this
district
about
boundaries.
like, jurisdictional boundaries?
Yeah, that's what I assume it is, because what it is there's like a segment beside Lake Johnson that's not included in any Raleigh district, but it's like surrounded by Raleigh district D. I'm just not sure why that, what the story behind that is.
When you say it's not in the district, does that mean you mean it's not in a voting district for a council member?
Yes, that is the case.
So that's in our extraterritorial jurisdiction, I'm guessing, and it has not been incorporated into the municipal boundary itself.
Okay, that's I assumed it was something similar to that, but I was not sure, and I was just there's so many of those in District D on the southwest side.
Is
They used to
what you're
refer to
referring
these
to?
as donut holes, where property has never been incorporated. It was developed most likely at a time the city limits had not grown that far out, and the properties have not been subsequently subdivided, or if they were subdivided at a time when municipal services were not available. So the city could not serve them with water and sewer. And so there was no requirement to annex in at the time of development. And for whatever it's worth, the people who live out here now have, I guess, have not sought to be annexed into the city. Obviously, that comes with additional tax burdens for doing so in exchange for other benefits, but not everybody is necessarily interested in increasing their tax bill in exchange for those added benefits. It's a personal evaluation, but there are lots of these holes around the city. The city used to have a pretty active program about annexation and what was referred to as forced annexation, meaning that people weren't necessarily seeking to be annexed, but the city was trying to fill these holes from an efficiency standpoint, as well as, currently if you're in one of these areas and you have an emergency, you're not going to get city police or fire. You're going to get county sheriff and, volunteer fire department will show up. Now, sometimes the city may show up beforehand, like the fire department, to keep the fire that's occurring in these non-municipal areas from spreading, to the city properties immediately next door. But they're typically, not obligated to serve those properties because they're not paying city taxes in exchange for city services. But a few years back, maybe 9-10 years ago or so, I don't recall the exact date, this legislature adopted some changes to the cities, or not just us, but statewide, municipalities' ability to force annexation on properties, and basically 50 plus 1%, I think, or maybe it's even slightly higher. Anyway, the majority of properties being annexed in a given area have to consent to the annexation. The city no longer enjoys the authority, to swing a heavy fist and take properties in without at least the majority of the property owners in the affected area agreeing to it. And typically, they're not going to agree to it unless they've sought it themselves. Historically, there were areas that were served by private wells and or private water, private water system for a neighborhood that became contaminated. And so over the years, those neighborhoods oftentimes would seek to be annexed into the city so they could receive city services such as water and sewer. But those are typically voluntary. And again, the city can continue to do those. We haven't had many recently of that nature. Typically an undeveloped property or a underdeveloped property going through redevelopment that was never annexed in is typically what submits an annexation petition. And they would do so as part of their essentially kind of chain of development approvals so that ultimately they can tap on to city water and sewer to serve their development.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And that matches what I heard. So thank you.
And Michael, just to provide a little bit more information, all of these are viewable layers on the county and city's IMAP system. So you're able to sort of search for a particular property, and then you can select from the layers and select corporate limits. They also have electoral boundaries that you can select as well to kind of see where the district boundaries are. Lots of useful information in IMAPs if you're ever curious.
I would note that the majority of these areas that you see, these unincorporated areas that we're speaking of, are going to be part of our extraterritorial jurisdiction, meaning any development activity that takes place there is still going to have to follow the city's Unified Development Ordinance, and it's going to be pretty restrictive on what they can do if we are able to serve the facility within a certain distance, I think, water and sewer. So if water and sewer are deemed available or readily available in the area, then they can do their development, seek an annexation, and tap onto the services. If we can't serve an area, then that's typically going to restrict what kind of development or how intense the development can be on those properties. So if water and sewer is not in the area, the city's not going to extend it on your behalf to serve your development. You're just going to have to wait till services creep out that way. And we do have a requirement if you're on the edge of the municipal boundary and you annex in to do your development, we obligate you to extend water and sewer typically to the far extent of your property. So the next property down the way, is now suited for annexing in, so on and so forth, like dominoes. But occasionally, some dominoes never fall. And these are these properties you're speaking to. They were glued firmly in place years ago when they were acquired or developed before the city boundaries had grown to those outer reaches. And sometimes they've been leapfrogged, and that's how they end up being completely surrounded by municipal land.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah, I sort of stumbled across this when I moved into my current place, and I've just been sort of curious about it since then. So thank you for explaining that. I appreciate you taking the time.
We'll plan to stay on for about 5 or 10 more minutes and see if any other questions come through. But may see some of us turn off our cameras. But feel free, of course, put a question in the chat and or raise your hand if there is anything else you'd like to get answered before we close down for the night. Oh, yes, Jen Truman.
Hey y'all, it's been a great listen and I appreciate all the details. I think I have a simple question that might be good, Ender. I'm just curious. I know you guys have studied other cities that are making similar changes. A lot of cities across the country are talking about this. Where do you think we kind of fall in terms of how progressive this sort of text change is compared to some of those other cities?
It depends on what you mean by progressive, but Portland, we studied Portland pretty intensively early on, before even TC5. I should say, hey Jen, how are you? And Portland does have, they use a floor area ratio standard, which is a little bit different than our lot area per unit standard. They do have a bonus system that allows maybe one additional unit or some additional FAR if, at least one of the units on the site is affordable to a certain AMI level. So for example, if somebody wants to build, if somebody has a lot and they think, oh, I can build a duplex, the city says, well, you could actually build a triplex if one of those units is affordable at 60% or whatever. I don't know exactly what the AMI levels are. They also have some interesting standards that give a bonus if the facade of the existing building is preserved. And so I think that is one way they tried to sort of retain some neighborhood character. So in that example, somebody buys a single family house and let's say they want to turn it into a quad apartment. If they retain the facade of that original house, they might get an FAR boost, which would allow, each of those units to be a little bigger or one of them to be significantly bigger, that sort of thing. There are, I think,
the original structure is kind of worth keeping.
This is true, and again, that was Portland's residential infill project. It's been on the books for about 1.5 years, and I'm not sure what success they've had with it. Austin has, I think there are a couple cities, Austin included, that do allow maybe some reductions in setback and sort of thing if units are affordable. I don't think they've had much success with that. I would say that the provision of apartment buildings and some of the setbacks that we've looked at, I would say are sort of best practice to some degree. I would say that they're also based on some of the precedent research we did was looking at old Raleigh neighborhoods, and some of those missing middle types you see in older Raleigh neighborhoods. You might see a quad apartment that has a side setback of just a few feet, and those neighborhoods are generally some of the most stable neighborhoods in the city. So potentially could see more of that. But yeah, I mean, we're prepared to adjust this. The city's monitoring missing middle housing permits and production, and we'll see how this works out. And if we need to tweak some things, there's always the opportunity to do that.
Thanks, Charles. I definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's kind of hard to fight the economics. A lot of those original missing middle duplexes and whatnot that are out there that have been maintained have oftentimes been converted to single family, even though they're originally constructed as 2 unit. Unfortunately, that's sometimes the money, they just want the single family house in the neighborhood and they can outbid the person that's providing, rental property. Historically, Raleigh has typically seen conversions from single to multifamily, more so when an area was in decline. Historically, that's where that's what it had been. And a lot of the city's regulations over the years that are sort of being peeled back were in response to keep that from happening to neighborhoods. And so that's why our code did go more toward encouraging single family development. But now the desires have shifted back to some extent. Everything old is new again, I guess, sooner or later.
Thanks, y'all. Definitely appreciate that overview and all the hard work. This is an exciting text change to see come